Morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Toni SCHOENENBERGER. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. As many of you know, STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact the society as a whole, but particularly also our companies, our businesses in the next few years. This is the third webinar in our series on orientation in times of no direction. Today we have the privilege to talk to Parag KHANNA. Parag, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you on this session.
Thank you so much, Toni. Always great to see you.
Parag is a leading global strategy advisor based in Singapore. He's focusing on geopolitical and geoeconomical and technological developments. According to many newspapers and magazines, Parag belongs to the most influential thinkers and strategy experts. So Parag, our expectations are pretty high. And I should also mention that Parag is a frequent speaker at STARS. So we are very much looking forward to your insights. We have exactly 30 minutes time with Parag to discuss a few questions. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your questions. And I'd like to encourage you to do it as quickly as possible because we are running out of time very, very quickly. So let's start with the first question. No doubt, Parag, today the world is crazy. And a lot of developments are really interconnected. So we have geopolitical, we have geoeconomic interactions, tensions, developments, and wars. We have systemic rivalries. We have actually the emergence of a multipolar world. We have climate change, energy crisis, migration, poverty. In addition to that, we have an awful lot of technological developments. So disruptions all over. So Parag, please, could you give us some orientation in this crazy world?
It's a great place to start. Thank you again, Toni. Delighted to be with you. And I especially value not only that, STARS is looking at impacts of trends on society, but from my experience with you, of course, there's a particularly tight relationship with Singapore and Switzerland. And that is very, very important because it is the societies that manage to stay one step ahead of complexity, whether it is volatility in currencies or commodities, whether it's geopolitical volatility, whether it's technological change, and to be one or two steps ahead, as Switzerland is, as Singapore is. They are the ones that show the way how to navigate. So there's a couple of lessons there. One, of course, is the virtue of scenario planning, right? And being prepared for everything. Diversifying your supply chain connections, diversifying your trade partnerships, having broad diplomatic relationships, having redundancy in your whether it's your energy supply or other areas. So all of these things are examples of what smart countries do. Another, of course, is sort of the virtue of small countries. It is a little bit not easier, but it certainly is more finite to try to navigate for a smaller country than a large country, right? And maintain social cohesion. And that is, of course, one of the areas of disruption that you've identified, right? Political and societal polarization. Smaller countries, find it easier to maintain that and to move the society along together. So I think that one other point is simply that we will not escape this complexity. This is the biggest picture answer that I can give, is that even anyone who gives you a one-stop solution is lying, because it's inherent in the meaning of complexity that the complexity is not simply going to settle itself. It's not going to resolve itself. And so we have to get used to a world where the geoeconomics, the geopolitics, the geotechnology are all colliding and leading to perpetually unpredictable outcomes on a long-term basis. And that's the definition, inherent in the definition of complexity, is that volatility and unpredictability and uncertainty. So I think of this as a permanent condition. And if anything, it also undermines the notion that we can neatly organize the world into a bipolar system, US versus China or something like that. That in fact, the world to me, as you know, is starting to look a lot like the Middle Ages, much more like the medieval system of hierarchies and many different layers of authority across the world, rather than a simple binary kind of system.
Right. Thank you very much. No doubt, and we come back to that, to some of the points you just mentioned. May I just go into Washington first? The US elections coming up in November. And this will certainly be key for many, many developments worldwide. What are your expectations regarding the US elections?
Well, our expectation is already come true, which is, of course, that we have a lot of uncertainty, and the uncertainty is building to some degree. When we frame it as Biden versus Trump, we don't even know if if the former will survive and if the latter will be in jail, right? So we have the issue of the heartbeat and the conviction. So the next, 6 months are full of uncertainty up until that point in time. We also don't know what the outcome will be in the key swing districts of the swing states. And interestingly enough, even though we have always known that for the past 20, 25, years, that many elections do come down to these few swing states, whereas the rest are pretty much baked in. We don't really know where these key districts are going to go. They truly are battlegrounds this time around, as a result of a number of the uncertainties that are shaping the electoral discourse, whether it is the wars in the Middle East, whether it is the economy and inflation and interest rates, and so on. So, and of course, the liberal conservative cultural divide that is penetrating these issues as well. So I think that most people would confirm or validate that this is probably one of the most uncertain elections ever. There is still a scenario, which is not worth dwelling on at too much length, but it does appear cyclically in the American political conversation, that as a result of the frailty and uncertainty around the two leading candidates, that there could be some kind of a change of candidates for either or both parties at their upcoming convention. So we really just don't know. And I think that this uncertainty, rightly bothers a lot of people, leaving aside the notion that one can even call into question whether or not there will be a peaceful transfer of authority, even putting aside that philosophical and existential almost issue. The fact that we're back with the same two candidates as as before, and that Trump obviously is in an unprecedented fashion attempting to be reelected after having lost an election, and the rigidity of the two-party system and all of these kinds of things, it really is, I think, and this is consistent with the way in which complexity works and how you respond to it. A lot of countries and societies are, of course, saying, we just need to hedge this, right? How do we minimize our dependence on the outcome of this situation? Some countries take a different approach. Some countries take the approach of saying, we're going to bet on one side or the other, right? We're betting that Trump will win, and therefore he will be soft on, fill in the blank, or he'll abandon Ukraine, or whatever the case may be. Or you'll bet in the other direction, and so, allocate capital accordingly and so forth. I think, though, for the rank and file, having to, either flip a coin or bet either side, rather than us presuming a certain degree of consistency and stability, irrespective of who is elected, that is what I think bothers the international community the most.
Yes, I mean, another topic being discussed an awful lot is obviously the US-China relations. There seems to be a newer containment policy, against China. It reminds me of the 1950s or whenever it was the first containment policy against China. How do you see that, generally speaking, the US-China relations? And perhaps you could also elaborate a little bit on Taiwan.
Right. Well, I mean, US-China relations are quite frankly very bad, right? They have not reached the point, obviously, of outright direct military confrontation. And at a micro level, we see hints, cyclical hints of dialogue restarting. For example, very recently, the defense ministers spoke again. They hadn't spoken in a long time. The Secretary of State of the United States is in China literally right now as we speak on a brief visit and having various meetings. But even there, it's very frosty. So it's frosty on a direct level as a result of the commercial related issues, export controls, technology related measures, the TikTok ban, semiconductors, and so on. And it's obviously very tense on a geopolitical level, you know, as it relates to Taiwan, South China Sea, and so forth. Now, when it comes to Taiwan, that also is cyclical. Let's remember 32 years ago in 1992, if we go back, you know, there was that was a period in time when right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, already people rushed to declare that this would be the World War III scenario. Now, it hasn't actually become World War III yet, right, to be clear. But what's clear is that China is waiting in a way for the world to become less reliant on Taiwan as a center of semiconductor production, so that it becomes less central as a geopolitical necessity to protect. So time, in many ways, is on the side of mainland China from a military standpoint, obviously with its own military and its area denial capability growing and so on and so forth. But I still believe, and this is the last 30 years have borne this out, that generally speaking, Asian powers have managed to suppress, you know, the geopolitical tensions to the degree that they don't explode into outright war. They prefer the low-level maneuvering, such as what we see happening in the South China Sea. But that said, that could change any time, right? And so I think, you know, Taiwan is only one of the trouble spots, but we do have to give some credit to the management of tensions that has been achieved by Asian powers thus far.
You mentioned in your introductory remarks the multipolar world. And actually, we are moving, or it seems to be, we are moving into that kind of multipolar world. I should mention the global south. We have the BRICS, we have the G20, etc. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how you see the world in maybe 2030 or maybe even in 2050?
Sure. You know, about 18 years ago, I made a PowerPoint slide, a map, a diagram of the multipolar world. And in 18 years, I haven't changed a single thing on that diagram, because this structural change is something that you can see coming from a long way off. And it is paradigmatic. It persists for long periods as well. So to me, this is truly the first global, durable, multipolar and multi-regional order. Some would say, well, Japan was powerful in the mid-20th century, and yes, it was, but of course that was an episode. It wasn't, you would say, systemic and durable. Now we have durable global superpowers with worldwide influence, such as China, on a scale that Japan never could have imagined, right? So you have a multi-regional world, right? Every region is central. Every region is a participant in the system. It's not a colonial, hierarchical sort of system like an imperial colonial model like the 19th century. Instead, of course, there's power asymmetries, but every region does have its own voice and can freely associate with each other. So Africa has a voice, South America has a voice, Arab countries have a voice, Europe, North America, and within Asia, you have multipolarity. So the true structure of the world's distribution of power, academically speaking, analytically speaking, is a multipolar world, and Asia is multipolar within that multipolar world, with China, Japan, India, Australia, even Russia, I think of as an Asian power. Russia is now, of course, isolated ever more from the European and Western diplomatic construct, and probably will be for a long time to come. But that doesn't mean that it is devoid of having associations, right? In fact, Russia is very much embraced in Asia, functionally speaking, if not diplomatically. You can see on the map behind me, of course, which country occupies North Asia. It's Russia. Russia is North Asia. For you in Europe, Russia is thought of as an errant Eastern European cousin. And of course, that is how they think of themselves in terms of Eastern European culturally and belonging to the European family, but having geopolitical disputes. I don't view Russia's future in line with that past or with that culture. I view Russia's future as effectively being the North Asian resource anchor to be used, exploited, engaged in the way that Asians see fit. And in their doing so, as China is, of course, doing, and India is, of course, doing, they are actually helping to prop Russia up, as are global oil prices and commodities markets and other countries that are violating the attempted sanctions. So yes, whatever your previous cultural and diplomatic frame of reference is towards Russia, it must evolve with the times. And so in my multi-regional, multipolar construct, I have really shifted the Russian flag from the European circle to the Asian circle. Let's put it that way.
On the other hand, I mean, there are lots of tensions between China and Russia, potentially speaking, you know, looking at Eastern Siberia and all the possible conflicts between the two countries. How do you see that?
Yes. You know, this is a particular issue and dynamic that I've been focused on for about 20 years now. And when I first started to report on and to synthesize the, you know, sparse information about Chinese exploitation of Russian commodities and resources and all of these kinds of things going on there, it earned me death threats from Russia, because people didn't want to hear anyone talking about this. Now, other people say it's become a full-blown alliance, but of course it's not that either. It is an alignment, but not an alliance. And those are different things. The term that I coined for many such relationships is multi-alignment, in which countries try to have as many strong relationships in as many directions as possible, rather than being stuck with only one partner in a hierarchical relationship. Now, this is not an option that Russia genuinely has right now, but eventually will obviously seek to rehabilitate itself and to have strong relations with multiple parties, not just with China primarily. So yes, there are a lot of tensions. There will continue to be tensions. So like I said, alignment, not an alliance. But the fact that Russia is Asian doesn't mean it's allied with China. It just means that it's part of what I call the Asian system. And the Asian system is the largest of the geographical regional systems. It's, again, the one behind me on this map. You're talking about 40 or 50 countries, 5 billion people. It will also be dynamic. It will also be, it will not be monolithic. And there's many tensions among the powers on this map. So we could spend all our time not even talking about the global system, but just talking about the dynamics of the Asian system, which are fiercely competitive and even conflictual. But there's also a huge amount of integration and convergence going on at the same time.
You also mentioned India, and there is obviously much talk about India. How do you see the potential of India, geopolitically speaking, but particularly also geoeconomically speaking?
Right. So India has finally emerged as a reliable pole of power in the Asian system. It is an anchor of the Asian system. It's not yet a global superpower by any means, not even close. Its share of the world economy, its GDP size is about 1/6, 1/5 that of China. So it's very, very far behind. Its reach in terms of financial and trade connectivity with the rest of the world is still insignificant compared to China. And it has enormous domestic structural obstacles that relate to everything from its own political polarization, despite the fact that Prime Minister Modi is set to win a resounding re-election right now. That of course masks the deep social and cultural tensions. There's environmental tensions, obviously. It's not doing a good job of managing climate change. It has very poor infrastructure and all of these kinds of things. So we cannot expect India to be like China on the global stage, and it will not be and probably never be like China on the global stage. But it is definitely an anchor of the Asian system now, and that is something that I think is firmly entrenched at this point.
In the audience, we have lots of business people, CEOs, etc. Now, the question obviously is looking at all these geopolitical and also geoeconomic developments. What is the impact actually on, first of all, on the global economy as a whole?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this. You know, the fact that we had higher growth rates associated with an era of frictionless globalization is not simply because you had an accelerated rate of trade integration. You simply had the uplifting out of poverty of, you know, many hundreds of millions, over 1 billion people between China and India. But now you have the demographic slowdown and even stagnation in many parts of the world, including China. So you just have structurally lower growth rates there as well. So I don't blame geopolitical tension for slower growth yet, because as you know, there's so many other headwinds that the world has faced: COVID, higher interest rates, demographics, and so on and so forth. So I think that we have to look at these things holistically rather than ascribing, you know, economic volatility or slowdown to only one or two things like geopolitics. And to be clear, geopolitics accelerates new types of globalization. One of the reasons that Southeast Asia is now attracting more greenfield corporate investment than China is because of geopolitics. And that is, of course, not anti-globalization at all. It's a new opportunity, new globalization. So we should not take any one relationship like US-China trade as the barometer or metric for globalization.
So we covered now lots of disruptions, and disruptions are all over actually. What advice would you give to companies, to group executive boards of companies?
Mm-hmm. I always endorse, you know, opportunism, right? And in the spirit of, first of all, multi-alignment. Don't have all your eggs in one basket, whether it's geopolitically, whether it's your political, diplomatic ties, your relationships. You know, really be global and have good relations globally. The second is operate more and more not like a home country rooted multinational, but more and more like a distributed partnership. Because you will have to play by local rules, right? There will be higher barriers to entry potentially. So local companies will be preferred amidst this trend towards industrial and financial protectionism and nationalism and so on. So becoming local everywhere and being a confederation, almost a partnership structure of firms, is probably the right type of firm structure. But never believe that globalization is in decline. Right? Never, ever. Because really, if you believe that, it just means that globalization is bypassing you and you are missing opportunity. So one of my philosophical, you know, words of advice is, you know, don't never bet against globalization. Just make sure you're capturing globalization.
Okay, thank you for this advice. There is one question from the audience. Peter Wiedel is asking, political processes in democracies seem to be rather slow. How could governments better deal with such situations?
Well, I don't generalize ever about democracies the way, you know, many political scientists do and studies do. You know, one speaks about Western, one has a vision in one's mind when one says democracy. But, you know, Indian democracy is democracy. It's flawed democracy. It's illiberal democracy. But it's certainly decisive in terms of the way in which the regime is pursuing its agenda. The same is true in countries like the Philippines. So it's not our kind of democracy. It's not Western European, multi-party, liberal, free and fair election, social democratic, welfare state democracy, but it's democracy. And even that type of democracy that we think of, that I was just describing in the European country, is very different from the Anglo-American democracy. I think those of you in Switzerland, Germany, or France would not look at the UK and America and say, aha, this is the paragon ideal of democracy, right? Far from it. So I really don't generally, strictly speaking, democracy is a method of leadership selection, right? It is not the form of government itself, it is the process. The form of government is vastly diverse across democracies: presidential republics, parliamentary systems, multi-party, two-party, so on and so on and so forth. So I really, really, really caution against even using the word democracies are, or that phrase. It's just simply not useful. Many, many different democracies are struggling. Many democracies are not struggling, to be clear. And therefore, I would not blame democracy itself, right? I would put the blame on other forces. So I'm not anti-democracy. I'm for following the right models of democracy, right, that are effective. And therefore, we would not be blaming democracy for democracy's problems.
Right. And there's another question. How do you see the future of Africa?
It's a big question. I mean, but generally speaking, fairly pessimistic. And I think we have to be clear about a couple of things. I'll just make 2 points among many. But first of all, Africa is a gigantic geological continental fact. But despite that, it is many different subregions. And the performance of these subregions is not correlated, quite frankly. West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, Horn of Africa, North Africa, very different trajectories right now, and not a lot of threads tying them strongly together. I can be optimistic about East Africa, but much less so about Sub-Saharan Africa. That's one point. The second is that we cannot overstate just how tragic COVID and the supply chain disruptions have been for Africa right now. If we look at the debt profile, the interest rates, the borrowing costs, the supply chain disruptions, the impact of climate change as well, all of these things happening simultaneously, it has been a very big setback for many, many, many countries in Africa. And therefore, I'm really not optimistic.
Remaining questions. The single biggest risk you see right now?
Well, I mean, in the spirit of our opening comments, in complex systems, you don't necessarily rank risks. You can weight their impact on different parts of the system geographically or thematically. But, it's in the nature of complexity that some risks may not appear to be huge right now, but could become huge overnight, the black swan type of risk. So you can worry about things that you do know and also things that you don't know when they'll happen. So it would be easy to say that a US-China war is the biggest risk, but then we could be saying that for 5 straight years. Should we also not be worried about the US election coming up? Of course, we should worry about that too. Should we worry about one of those more than the other? Not necessarily. Right? Should we also be worried about, again, social polarization and the lack of affordability in housing markets and the, millennial generations lack of, again, economic security? I worry about that also. I worry about that every day. There are days when I worry about that and don't worry about World War III. Then there are days that I worry about World War III and don't worry about the inequality. So the truth is we have to spend our time understanding how these relate to each other rather than ranking them.
So we should end with a positive note. Therefore, last question. How optimistic are you looking at the world today?
Well, I'm a systemic optimist because I believe that we are building redundancies in the system. We're growing more food in more places. We're building more transportation and energy and communications linkages. Capital is fungible and mobile. More people are allowed to travel and to move than ever before. Many are not, but many are. So fungibility, mobility, connectivity, these are actually almost mathematical attributes of a system that has redundancy so that supply can meet demand and we can shift resources where needed and we can build resilience wherever we can. So I'm generally optimistic in that long-term sense, but the problems that we are solving and becoming more resilient about are problems that I wish we didn't have, because we could have seen them coming. We could have done so much more about climate change, for example, many years ago than we are now. So even if we manage to solve or stabilize climate, right, we will say, wow, we've built a more resilient world, but we should have foresight and not have had this problem be as bad as it is. And you can say the same thing about polarization of politics. We knew what we were doing wrong and didn't fix it. You can see the same thing in US-China relations. We know where things are going and have not been bold enough to intervene and find common ground. So I wish we didn't have the problems that we are actually, fortunately, capable of solving.
Unfortunately, time is up. The title of this webinar was Orientation in Times of No Direction. And indeed, I believe orientation is needed in this, as we said, crazy world. So Parag, thank you very much for your insights and analysis. You helped us to better understand all these disrupting phenomena in complex, interconnected systems. So we wish you all the best, and I personally look very much forward to having you again at STARS Symposia and STARS webinars. Thank you very much again, Parag, and all the best.
Likewise, thank you so much.
The next speaker in this webinar series will be Volker Perthes. That will be on the 31st of May. Volker Perthes was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations in Sudan, Iraq, former director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Berlin, Germany, and he is a leading global strategy expert. I hope to see you then. Goodbye, take care, and bon weekend. Thank you.